Welcome to Grief Uprooted, a podcast dedicated to sharing your grief stories. Together, we embark on the mystery of one's grief journey as they learn to live, heal, and be courageous in a world rooted in trauma. Join myself, Christine, in an open discussion to help you uproot the grief in all our lives. I am an award winning author, professional speaker, and humanitarian in the field of grief and trauma. I want you to be part of the discussion. Welcome back to Grief Uprooted. Before we start today's episode, I just want to send out a huge thank you to all of you who have been following on Instagram, been following on Facebook, the YouTube, Twitter. What else is there? All those social media sites. Also, click follow on Spotify. Love your support. The more people we can reach, the more people we can start uprooting their grief. Today's episode, I really want you to take a moment and just ponder a question for me before we start. And what was your vision of your life? I really need you to open up your mind, really have no judgment, and possibly alter your perspective on grief in all its forms. And what I mean about that is we are going to talk about compounded grief. We're going to talk about how grief can layer itself over one thing, over another, over another, over another, and how we are presented with things in life that weren't what we expected, and how that grief really hits us. I'm welcoming Sarah Frazer all the way from West Virginia. She is an author. She talks about grieving something that she really didn't sign up for, and how that process works for her. So join us today. Do click follow. Please reach out to us with your questions, concerns, comments. The bigger we grow, the more people we can help, and the more people we can bring to that process of healing their grief and doing that together, because it is only together that we heal in our grief. Take care, and I'm excited to bring you this episode. Bye, guys. Welcome back to Grief Uprooted. Today, I want to pose a question before I introduce you to my guest, Sarah Frazer, who is the author of I Didn't Sign Up for This. What was your vision for your life? I want you to take a moment before we start today and literally, let's just close our eyes and tell me in your inside voice to your own mind, where did you think you would be? Where did you think you would be at this very moment in your life? Did you have a plan all set out? Did you have an idea? And as you see that idea, what happens when you realize you haven't done that? What happens if you realize you went down a different path or a different journey than what you expected of your life? That's exactly what we're going to explore today. We are going to look at what happens when that vision doesn't turn out exactly how you predicted. So welcome, Sarah. I am so excited to have you. I am so excited to have you on today and actually talk about this topic, because I think it's a form of grief that people never talk about. So welcome.
Thanks, Christine. Thanks for having me. I am excited about this conversation. I think it is also something necessary that we need to acknowledge as we walk through our grief.
For sure, for sure. I do too. And so I just want to share with people a little bit about your grief story and kind of what brought you here to want to share your story. I know you're an author. I love the title. I love that I didn't sign up for this, because I think a lot of us haven't signed up for the grief and trauma we've experienced in our life. But really, what is your grief story? Where does that start?
I think that if you were to have asked me that probably 10 years or so, I would have maybe mentioned a grandmother that passed away or, something along that lines. And then something happened in our family that made me look at grief in sort of a different way. I've always associated it with the death of a person, which it
Mhm.
is. That is a big part of grief. But with our family, we have three biological children, and when the youngest was 2, we began the adoption process to bring home a little girl from China. We didn't know if we were going to get a little girl or a little boy. We were open to both, and we went through an adoption agency, did all of that paperwork, um, flew all the way to China, and was handed this little bundle of um, a little Chinese girl. And as soon as she was placed in my arms, I knew something
Mhm.
was not right. It's like that moment. I just knew. She was so heavy, and I knew her weight and her height because they had set all her measurements ahead of time. And I thought she's too heavy, and she's not really holding her head up. She was 2 years old at the time, and we just knew. My husband and I exchanged this look of, okay, something's not quite right. We took her back to the hotel room after receiving her, and I undid all of, she had like 4 layers of clothes on, which is a very cultural thing there. Um, I had sent 2 outfits, and she had both outfits on, plus 2 other outfits. And so and she was so thin and so tiny, but we were told that she had a certain medical condition, and we just took one look at her and thought, that's not true. It's something else going on. My husband is an actually a physician, and so he was looking her over, and he's like, this isn't exactly what we thought we were getting. And over the course of those couple weeks we're in China and then bringing, her home, I suddenly realized that I was all of a sudden the mom of a child with special needs. And I really wasn't, I don't know if I just didn't think in my head that that was a possibility. I don't think any parent has that on their radar when they're either adopting or giving birth or whatever. That's not something that you just say, okay, this is a good possibility. I don't think you have that on your radar when you're having children. And so suddenly I find myself in the middle of grieving something. And at the time, I think for the first 3 or 4 months, I didn't recognize it as grief. I pushed all of those feelings aside, and I just focused on what we could do to either diagnose her or get her better or do something to fix the situation. And then over time, as we realized the severity of her special needs, we realized there was no easy, quick fix to this. This was going to be months, if not years, if not lifelong physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, all of those with an unknown medical diagnosis. And even today, she
So I'm going
just
to stop you right
okay, go ahead.
there because you've given me goosebumps and I'm in awe. So I want to go back to the moment because what you said, um, you're a mom. Like,
Mhm.
I love how they put this baby in your arms. And I did not feel rejection out of you at all. I felt like this was my baby. This is my girl. And
Yeah.
I just love that. I, I'm giving myself goosebumps just listening as I hear you and your husband, and him being a practitioner, that, hey, this is our baby. This is what we were given, and
Mhm.
bringing her back to the hotel room. And, you know, yeah, wow. It was like that was your birth moment. And
It
so,
was. It was. It was a birth moment for sure. I had all of the feelings of
uh,
just overwhelmed feelings,
but
grief,
even
joy, everything.
yeah, and you're talking about weight, and you're talking because I have 3 children, and I remember my oldest struggling, and I remembered those thoughts, like, this child's not chubby enough, he needs to eat more, and like, it was like your mother instincts just clicked in, like, this is my baby, but there's something not quite right. So
Yeah.
um I just love that love and compassion I'm feeling from you right now. I just think that is so beautiful. um and and yeah, just the amount of work. that goes into adoption. That's the
Yes.
other part. Like, how long did it take for you? Because I know there are people out there that are wanting to adopt a child, but that process is so exhausting, so long, and costly. And I think that a lot of people are going on that roller coaster, but wonder if they'll ever. So, what was the process like of trying to adopt?
Yeah, so my husband and I really felt the pull and the draw at right after we had our second biological child, but we just kind of put it off, and we were kind of drawn to it, but we just kind of put it off. And then I had my third child, and biologically, and it was a really rough pregnancy.
Mm,
It ended up being my third C-section. It was just my hormones were all over the place. It was just, my husband, we got done with that pregnancy. We brought our baby home. He said, "You're never doing that again." And so we both knew we wanted more children. And so we thought, okay, well, what about adoption? So I probably researched for about a year. So, like, as soon as she was born, I started researching for about a year. And there's so many different directions that you can
mhm,
go as far as adoption, and we looked into all of them. It just so happened that we ended up on international adoption, and then when we looked at travel time, because of his job, he couldn't travel, and spend months overseas, which is the case for a lot of countries that you're adopting internationally. China was only 2 weeks.
mm,
And so they had really streamlined the process. So we decided to pursue that. And so I remember we filled out our application. I think it was January 1st of that year. And we were told it would be a 2 or 3 year process. And so we kind of, went into it with that kind of mindset. It ended up only being 15 months
oh,
from
wow.
the time we finished the paperwork
Yeah.
until the time that we brought her home. So it was like January 1st, we brought her home March of the next year. So it was, so even I would encourage people that are saying it's really long process. It depends. It
Mm,
really does depend. There are so many factors involved. I know after COVID, international adoption changed tremendously.
mhm,
So this was all, back in 2014 and 15.
mhm,
So it's been many years since then. And so I would caution against maybe international adoption. I know our agency just sent a letter out last week saying that they're closing international adoptions
mm,
because of the wait lists are so long and travel restrictions are so strict. They're just so strict. So, but domestic adoptions are still available. Foster to adopt is also a great option. But you do have to realize that it could be as short as a few months, or it could be several years. I think that unknown is really scary for people,
mhm,
but what really fueled us on was the fact that there are so many children
mm,
that need homes.
yeah.
You look at any statistic and you see that there are children. And I remember reading an adoption book once, and the author said, "There's nothing special about me and my wife's DNA."
Yeah.
And that kind of struck me because I thought, you know, we think, oh, I want a child that shares my DNA, which I have three, so I can't really speak to those families that are struggling with infertility, which is another type of grief that I have not experienced, but that is another added layer. But I think that knowing that there are children out there that need homes, I definitely don't think adoption's for everyone, but I do think that if you feel that pull and that draw, just pursue it. See
Yeah.
how far you get. And so I always encourage people to just look into it.
Yeah, and I think you were grieving, the fact that no more babies were coming out of you.
Yes, yes,
Like,
I did. I did have to grieve
section
that.
3 C-sections is a lot on the body,
It
and
is.
then to accept, "Okay, I'm not making any more babies."
Mhm.
So this is really a turn in the road for you, and go, "Okay, so, we're gonna reach out and adopt." So, when you got her home, what is her name?
Her name is Leanna.
Leanna. So when
Yes.
Leanna comes home, how was the
welcome from everybody else, and how did it progress to see that she was having medical issues?
So we knew right away that she had medical issues. She couldn't sit up, she couldn't walk, she couldn't talk. She was 2. I don't think she had ever had solid foods.
Mhm.
And so very malnourished. So we brought her home. Of course, all of our family, our friends, my children, they all just accepted her
Mhm.
immediately. It was an immediate acceptance. It was immediate love and just a joy that she was home because they had walked through those 15 months with us and they knew, all of that. And um, I remember though that I confided with my mother a little bit at the beginning, and that's actually where the title of my book comes. I remember saying that to her on the phone when I was in China. I remember saying, I didn't sign up for this. And she was very encouraging, and she said, this isn't your plan, but it was always God's plan. And that kind of has helped, part of that helped me kind of walk through and say, okay, we're going to walk on this road. Um, but I avoided all of that grief. I was avoiding all of that grief.
Mhm.
I had pictured a certain little girl, and I think we do this for all of our children when they're born. We picture their future. We picture what they're going to be like as toddlers and young people and teenagers and adults, and we say, we want all the good things for your life. We want you to be happy and we want you to be joyful and we want you to be successful. We want all the things for you. And I remember looking at her and it was a twofold feeling. It was fear because I felt very inadequate. I
Mhm.
thought I didn't prepare for this. I can't do this. This is not, I don't have it in me. This isn't.
Yep.
And then what is her future going to look like? I had to grieve that she wasn't going to have the future that I envisioned for her.
Mhm.
And I think that I avoided that grief for a couple reasons. I think I avoided because I felt like, well, I'm a very strong believer in God and His plan and His control in life. And so if I was upset or disappointed or mad or angry or all of those grief feelings, then I wasn't trusting Him.
Mhm.
I felt, oh, I'm not trusting
Mhm.
if I'm feeling all of this. So I tried to avoid those feelings because I thought I'm not having faith, not having faith, right? And then I also avoided grieving because I knew that if I voiced it out loud, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, if I voiced it, I felt like my grief isn't as bad as someone else's. Um, we brought home a little girl, although she had special needs. She was otherwise healthy in a lot of other ways. We had a little girl, and I remember distinctly about a year and a half after that, one of my really close friends lost her child.
Mhm.
Um, and he was about uh 17 months, I think, not quite 2. And I remember thinking that I felt guilty that I was sad about this situation in my life. And it was then that I realized that there can be no comparison to grief.
We interrupt this podcast for a dirty moment. Hey everyone, I am in the Museum of Art in Ottawa in an Indigenous exhibit, and yeah, I'm just being triggered. And I really thought it's a perfect time to kind of take a moment to reflect on what triggers are and what I've coined dirty moments. But what I mean by that is they just hit us sometimes and they cause a reaction within us to cry or to feel things that we're not necessarily comfortable with, that being a dirty moment. But sometimes these triggers are meant to be felt. This museum alone has truly inspired me and made me reflect on how grateful I am in the work that I've been doing with the Indigenous cultures. So I just wanted to take a moment and say, yeah, this is a trigger for me, but it's a good one. And it hits my heart. But I think sometimes we need to feel these things so that we're grateful for what we have. Take care, everybody. Bye.
There is no comparison. I can't compare my grief to her grief, and she can't compare it. Every person is being asked to walk some kind of grief in their life. And so if
Right.
I start comparing, I I don't deal with the grief in my own life.
Yeah.
And it
And
was, yeah.
to back up and unpack that, because I love the things that you're commenting on, and thank you for your strength to comment on them, because I know that God is a subject that we sometimes want to avoid, but I've come to learn that grief is the only thing in life that doesn't discriminate. Doesn't care how wealthy you are, doesn't care what color your skin is, it doesn't care about anything. It completely drops all of us to our knees. It is the only thing that doesn't discriminate. And God is something different for everyone. And I remember after my brother fell over in Niagara Falls and struggling and struggling. And I was raised in a very Catholic family. And I was talking to actually a Christian Reformed priest or Christian Reformed minister, got to get that right, or pastor. And when we were talking, I was talking about my grief when I was a teenager. And I said, well, God killed my brother. And that man looked at me and said, what if God was standing beside you when he fell over the falls? And my head spun
Yeah.
because I went, you just changed my perspective.
Yeah.
Damn you. Right. Because I went, oh, I never thought of that. And so my perspective shifted. But the guilt that comes with that, and how you're saying, well, then I wasn't having this belief in something bigger, be it God or whatever. Then we block our grief. We stick it in a jar. We block it up because it's too hard. And then you say to yourself, well, at least she's not dead. I don't know how many times I hear that from people who are dealing with compounded grief or anticipatory grief or dealing with a disability in their life. They're constantly say, well, at least I'm not dead. And I sometimes look at them and say, grief comes in so many different forms. And watching somebody you love suffer or die is excruciating. And we should not devalue that experience. We should be able to look at that experience and say, I am grieving, because it's all compounded. And, all those little griefs that happen before in your life where you can no longer have children or the death of a relative, or they all compound. And then you hit this moment and you think, whoa, this feels so overwhelming. But it's all been compounded up to this point. So I love how you're saying, like, I had to stop myself and go, I need to grieve. And how do I do that? Because nobody talks about it. Nobody's going to teach you this one. So this is why you've created a great book. But so
Yeah.
as you get through this and you decide that you're going to start this grieving process, how is she medically? Like, are we taking her to doctors? Is it starting to monopolize your life?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So she was taken to all the doctors initially that first year, and they couldn't figure out anything.
Mm,
All the tests came back normal. For 2 years, we had nothing. We had no explanation as why she wasn't speaking or she was really struggling to walk. And, um, she struggles with like an uncoordinated kind of movement. She didn't fit into any boxes.
mm,
And so having that, it was 2 years before we had sort of a diagnosis, but it was more of this is what it's called now, but we have no idea what caused it.
mm,
Even to this day, she is 11 years old, so it's been 9 years. We have no official diagnosis, which is very, very hard as far as getting her any kind of government help. So
Yes.
that has been a process. But at those very beginning stages, I felt like if I had a name, if
Yeah.
I had something to hang to see, but no one could tell us.
Mm.
No one could tell us what they were. And so I began to be obsessive about it.
Yeah.
Um, Finally I thought, when can she catch up? That was what my mind was focused on. And I had a therapist coming, we had some coming into our home at the beginning when she was real young. And one of them looked at me and she said, "You need to stop trying to catch her up." She said, "You need to start thinking, what does she need to do next? Like,
Mm.
what's the next thing that she needs to do?" And I remember that stuck with me because that was a freeing moment for me to realize that it wasn't my job to fix it, for one. Number two, there may never be a catch up moment, and I have to be okay with that. Um, and I'm not going to know what her future is. I wanted to know, is she going to live with us the rest of her life? Is she going to live independently? That was that was the underlying question. That was what I was grieving, that unknown.
Yeah.
And when I finally let that go over a period of several months, probably at least a year or two, I realized that I could just enjoy where she was right now,
Mhm.
see the progress. She's always continued to make progress. And so, but I had to grieve the fact that the future that I had in mind for her was may or may not happen.
Mhm.
And I am such a planner person. You asked
No.
all those questions at the beginning. I'm like, I had a life plan. I had a 10-year plan. I had a 5-year plan.
Yeah.
And when we adopted her, all that went out the window. And so I realized that I was becoming more obsessive about the plan. And
Mm.
when I started to let go, and then there was a moment, I remember it's almost like I can picture the moment when I realized all of these feelings and emotions I was having was grief.
Mm.
I don't think I wanted to acknowledge it. I don't think I was recognizing it. I remember I was walking on our treadmill in our basement.
Mhm.
I was watching her on the floor play. She was laying on her back. She was playing with some toys, and our son, who was 4 at the time, was laying beside her. And he had laid down beside her and was kind of interacting with her. And it was almost, I felt a whisper from God saying, He's going to take care of her.
Mm.
It was almost an audible voice. It wasn't, but it felt that way.
Yeah.
And I just started weeping
Mhm.
as I thought about him as as a grown up taking care of his sister. And they've had a bond. He's our second born, and he's very much similar in personality to her, and they've always got along really well. They never fight. And I I just remember having this sense of he's going to take care of her
A sibling.
as
He's
a sibling. Yes.
a sibling.
And I worried about, of course, my biological children. Are they going to be upset that they have a sibling like this? Are they going to be fighting when my husband and I are gone? Who's going to take care of her? But it was almost like in that moment, I got sort of a glimpse, and I started crying.
Mhm.
And it surprised me. My tears surprised me. And that's when it hit me. You're grieving.
Yeah.
You're grieving.
Mhm.
And after that, I said, okay, I need to treat this like a loss.
Mhm.
It feels weird and disconnected. There's not been a funeral. There's not been an obituary. There's not all those things that we think of when there's the death of a loved one or death of someone. But I realized all of these emotions were actually grief emotions.
Yeah.
So I began the process of grieving and just allowing myself, giving myself permission to grieve and not feel guilty about it.
Mm. And that's the hardest. Like when you're
Yeah.
talking, it's not that this is a comparison, but it's similar to that miscarriage, uh,
Yes.
or giving birth to a baby that's developmentally um, having issues and medical issues, and work closely with palliative departments, hospital for sick kids, IWK, all these different hospitals, children hospitals, and they order a lot of resources from us and do speaking engagements and things. So we're meeting parents consistently like this that
Yeah.
had these expectations. And I think that grieving process is so hard because it is not spoke about. It's not realized, it's not recognized. So you're kind of left in limbo. So when you decided, okay, this is grief, and I have to somehow work myself through this, I'm a firm believer that grief is a natural process.
Yes.
A lot of times, that's always been how I look at it. Being somebody who's grieved and experienced trauma, I believe that there's three modalities to it. We start to normalize it in our thought pattern, we start to integrate it into our body, and then we find some self stabilizing techniques to help us through. So when
Yeah.
you got to this point, what I think what I'm feeling is this ultimate, okay, I got to accept this. And I think you got
Yes.
that reassurance, and
Yes.
that allowed you to go, everything is going to be okay. So what were some of the things, I know a lot of our listeners would love to know, what are some of the things that you did? That guilt, that's the one I struggle with. Guilt is just it's just horrible. I don't know how else to explain it. And I know guilt is very self-inflicted. Um,
Yes.
so what were some of the things that you did to kind of start yourself with this?
One of the things that I did is I shared with my husband that
Mm,
I was grieving.
mm,
And it suddenly we both realized we were both grieving. I was grieving more
mm,
um than him I shouldn't say more. I was grieving differently than
mhm.
he was grieving. Um and then one of the most humbling but also freeing was I shared with some friends
Nice.
that I this is grief.
Mhm.
And I'm so blessed to be able to have friends to look at me and say, yeah, it is. And
Mm,
I'm really sorry for you. And not to be judgmental. They were not judgmental. They were very sweet and kind and understanding. But sharing it with others, I think, is very important.
mhm.
Acknowledging it to myself first, and then telling other people almost made it real as
Yes.
well. Like
Yes. Yes.
telling other people, I am grieving. And realizing and then I connected it too as I started to explore the time of year that it was.
Mhm.
This has been something I have noticed my year. Every year we brought her home in March. My grandmother, um, her birthday is in March and she passed away in October, but her birthday's in March, and that was the first person as an adult that I lost,
Mm,
and that was very close to me. And so I had my grandmother's birthday plus this trauma of bringing this child home, um, all happened in March. And so every March, I wish it wouldn't surprise me, but every March, the last week of February into the first week of March, I can feel something in my body. I'm much more irritable. I just feel it in my body. If I'm gonna get sick, I usually get sick that time. Um, so I've learned as the years and the months go on to give myself grace
mm,
and to say, this is not how I'm not going to feel this all year long, but in March, I'm going to feel it. I'm going to feel the sadness. I'm going to feel the disappointment. My body reminds me every year, even if my mind has forgotten. And so allowing my body to say, you need to slow down.
mm,
Don't be rushing around. Don't be over planning your day. Take some time to just grieve. And like you said, I feel like it is a natural process, but I
mhm.
also feel like it's a lifelong process. And you've probably talked about this as well. Um, this isn't a grief that is just going to eventually go away. This is a grief that I'm going to hold. And my life has been woven around this grief. So it's not so poignant as it was at the beginning. Um, they do say time heals, and it does, but we
Mhm.
have to also acknowledge that that grief comes up.
Yes.
also, I thought maybe we could talk a little, you could talk a little bit about this as well. I've always thought of grief as the one time it happened, like, that's the one instance, but that's the rock thrown into the pond, and then you have ripples for the rest of your life.
That's a
And
really good analogy.
yeah, so you have the initial plop of the rock into the pond, but
Yeah.
then the ripples of grief are coming.
Hmm.
I grieved the fact that all my children are in school now, but she's homeschooled with me. It's just a better
Hmm.
situation for her to be homeschooled. They toured their school. We moved to a new area. They all went are going to the same campus school. And we got into the car and she started crying because she knew she wasn't going to go to the school. And
Yeah.
I started crying because I wanted her to be able to go, but there's a small little school and they don't have the resources for her. And so I just was grieving
Yeah.
that. And it's like another grief ripple. And to deal with it,
Yeah.
acknowledge it, and then say, okay, I'm going to this is going to be better, but right now this is really sad.
It
And
is.
give yourself grace.
And to go back to the day you're talking about, my brother died June 21st, 1986.
Yeah.
And every anniversary of this, I forgot the date. I was 14
Yeah.
when he died. And I was complete mess that week. And I would never understand what was wrong with me. And then as I got into this industry and continued with my career, I went, oh my goodness, my body recalls it.
Yes.
And so the body recalled it. And I would be sick, I would be tired, I would be crying, going, I don't know why I'm crying. And I was young, so I was like, oh, it must be my period's coming.
Yeah.
Oh, this must be happening. Oh, I must be. And then I would go, oh, it's the day my brother died.
Yeah.
And so the day of, that's the shocker. But the grieving afterwards is when the people stop bringing stuff and you're isolated. That's when you really start to ponder all this stuff. So I think it's so common for people to have that reaction and not be aware of it, because mentally we want to say that didn't really happen. But
Yeah.
physically, the body retains, I always say to people, it retains muscle memory.
Yeah.
Why in the world wouldn't it retain memory? Like if it can remember to lift a weight, it can remember what happened.
Yeah.
And so the body holds all this. And, then to have those triggers and what you're talking about, that ripple effect. I actually, when I read your story, I pulled out a Russian doll. Do you remember these?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I have all sorts of trinkets, but if I take this doll apart and we go down to the very small one,
Yeah.
that's where we start.
Yeah.
And then what I find happens is we have another grief that gets layered on.
Yeah.
And that's like that ripple. And then we have another ripple that gets put on. And we just keep going. And we learn these techniques as these things ripple and ripple and ripple.
Yes.
And, we hope not to hit the point where sometimes we bust and we all crack down to that inner child or that person down there. But I think it's a fact of life, and
Yes.
that we experience this. And that's where we need to learn to not normalize it. I keep trying to think of a different word, but that integration process is going to happen. And it sounds like with your grief, you were able to recognize it and then allow it to integrate.
Hello, everybody. This is Christine. I'm interrupting this podcast just to take a moment to address that compounded grief is something that we deal with on a daily basis. A lot of us don't realize that the loss of a loved one to death, trauma, illness, all has an effect on us. And I learned really from this podcast the word spiritually bypassing, where we bring our faith in so that no matter what that faith is, and really avoid the grieving process. So I wanted to just interject in this podcast and let you know that we're here to welcome all faiths and all grief in all its forms. No matter the process you're experiencing or your culture or faith that brings to your grief, You are loved and accepted. This is one person's story. And often, if we start comparing our grief to somebody else's grief, we will go down a very dark hole. And just know that your grief, no matter what form it comes in, no matter what the background being, it deserves the ability to heal. You deserve the ability to heal. Grief comes in many, many forms. It is the only thing in life that does not discriminate, and it can compound over years, and over years. So we may lose somebody when we're a child to death. Then we may experience a divorce. Then we may experience the loss of the life that we expected. And the way we process and grieve towards these, I guess, smaller episodes of grief in our life can be in a very, very large way. No judgment. Open your mind, your heart, and realize you should love and accept yourself. Now back to the podcast.
When that trigger hit or that ripple hit, you're able to really calm yourself down and go, this is part of it. This is part of it. And that level of acceptance that
Yeah.
I have to walk this path and I'm walking it with her. I'm
Yes.
walking it
Yes.
with her.
Yeah.
And this was the plan. May have not been the one I thought I was getting. But it is the one I was given. So with all of this and listening to you, I do hear such great strength from you. I know that often we don't see our own strength, but I see a lot of strength within you. And I'm wondering how the book came about, and was journaling part of this? So when we kind of just back it up for our listeners, the very first thing for you was that realization and acceptance. And then really embracing those ripples and going, okay, this is what happens, and then reaching out to others. I don't think anybody grieves alone. I think completely wrong if you think that you can do this on yourself, like by yourself. It doesn't work. You
No.
cannot sit somewhere and grieve alone. I once, I moved to share this story, but I worked in a woman's shelter, and I took a contract and I was working with this woman who was badly beaten. And she was grieving the loss of really her life.
Yeah.
And here I was in the shelter with her, and she had recognized me from the news. And I had aided in September 11 terrorist attacks at Ground Zero. And she brought her head up and she said, my pain is nowhere near what you saw, what you've seen in life.
Yeah.
And I went, no, yours is worse. And her head came up and these big red puffy eyes. And she goes, what? You're alone. That's worse. I
Yeah.
go, to be sitting here in a shelter alone with your pain is worse. So let's get together. Let's get you into a group. Let's get you talking. And that's what really, we can't do it alone. We're not meant to do it alone. We're
No.
meant to do it together. So I love how you're saying, that realization, then telling my friends, and then that general acceptance through these ripples. And then how did this book come? Like, did you start journaling or?
So I've always been a journaler and I've always been a writer. And so it kind of just naturally, this ended up in my journals, these thoughts and these feelings. But really, where the book came out was, or came from, was when COVID hit. And I realized that we all had plans and they were completely destroyed March of
Oh,
2020.
true.
And so, but what I realized as my husband and I walked through that period in our life, those months together as a family, we felt like we've walked this before.
Mm,
Like we walked this with our daughter.
yeah.
And look at all the lessons that we've learned from walking this with our daughter. And I began to write down all the things that I had learned. And I also was reading the story of Moses in the Bible, and he had great plans for his life. He was going to lead the people, the Israelites, out of Egypt, out of slavery, and he was going to, be God's leader. And God completely interrupts his path, and he's not 40 years old when he does eventually lead the people out. He's 80 years old.
Mm,
And he spent 40 years in the wilderness alone
mhm,
and being nobody. And I remember thinking, what things are in his life are similar to my life, and what are some lessons that his life teaches me about my life, but also what can I share with others? I want to encourage others that, not just COVID, but I began to think, there's always been some, as you shared at the beginning, we've all had expectations for our life that have not come. I mean, maybe some have come to fruition, but not everything. And we have this idea of where we thought we would be. And I don't think any of us thought we would be where we were March of 2020. And so I think that that's where the book process came for me. I was wanting to share, these are the lessons that I've learned. This is how you can still have confidence and hope and peace and joy in the midst of all of these really unexpected twists and turns. And so that's where the book came, and what my passion and my heart is to encourage people that, yes, this is really hard. It looks like grief,
mm.
and it is grief in a lot of cases, but there is hope and there's peace and there's joy possible moving
Yeah.
forward.
And you're never too old. He was 80. He was never too
Yes.
old, never
Yes.
too old to do anything in life.
Oh, no,
And
and just because this plan didn't work out doesn't mean that there isn't something in the future. And I believe all of us have a purpose. And I believe that we often think, well, I've missed it because of this or that. But that just isn't true. This just isn't true. And so I hope to encourage people with this book to
mhm.
just keep going forward.
Yeah. And taking, one of the greatest books written, there's so many books out there, but, just looking at what people have been writing for all these lessons for how many decades, billions and billions, right?
Yeah.
And they've written it in a different form, but they all come back to that similar lesson that,
Mhm.
life is challenging. Life
Yeah.
has these hurdles that, you know, I wish we taught our children in the school system what grief was.
Yes.
And that conversation actually came up
Yeah.
because it is a mind, body, spirit experience. It's not something that's just solely based in one area. And being able to go, okay, it's okay to talk about this. It's okay to bring it up. So if I was to read this book, what
Uh-huh.
would it be like? Is it stories, or is it antidotes? Is it things I can do? Tell me a little bit about it.
Yeah, so each the format of the book kind of uses Moses's life to kind of tell the story. And so you're reading about Moses's life from the Bible, but also I share a lot of personal stories, different anecdotes from my own life that relate to Moses, but each chapter ends with some reflection questions.
Mhm,
And so I encourage the reader to kind of dive into their own story
mhm,
and their own journey, and answer some really deep questions at the end of each chapter. Each chapter has a little bit of a different focus on different aspects of Moses's story that they might relate to. And so as you read it, you're really just following the life of Moses, and I share, like I said, I share a lot of story about my daughter, but other things that have happened to our family too that we didn't plan for. Job loss, moves, my own postpartum depression. I didn't plan for that. And I don't think anybody plans for that, but just
Yeah,
walking through that season in your life. And so hopefully there's some encouraging stories in there, but also those deep reflection questions that they can use in their own life.
I love that. I love that because I think that none of us have really planned anything. We think we've got it all figured out, and this is what I'm going to do. But I often tell people I think it's an occupational hazard. I never really plan anything. And it's because in trauma, you can be called out, or so I often give myself like a little bit of an agenda and go, this is what I'm planning, but I'm totally okay if it doesn't work out that way.
Yeah.
Because half the time, you have to kind of go with the flow.
Yeah.
I love how uh, you're using this and giving them a story and then putting a personal thing to it and then asking questions. I think that is so great. And people can get this on Amazon. They can get it from your website, which is sarahefrazer.com.
Yes.
And I know you mentioned all the bookstores, Barnes and Nobles, all those things. It's
Yes.
called I Didn't Sign Up for This. So I want to make sure that everybody's heard that. I wanted to kind of ask on one last question.
Mhm.
And the reason I'm asking this is because, as I mentioned, grief does not discriminate. So I love to bring all different cultures, all different faiths together here at Grief Uprooted. And I know prayer itself. We often think about Hail Mary or we think of Our Father, we think of standard prayers. But
Mhm.
I'm noticing in the next generation and working with them, um, prayer has evolved to a form of kind of meditation.
Mhm.
And so I'm just wondering, like, is there anything that you could say to our listeners that how you would approach that in these moments when you're thinking, I'm being the ripple effects coming or the triggers coming? Is there anything you say to yourself, like a mantra or anything that kind of helps you through?
I think for me, prayer is a way for me to connect with God.
Mm,
And so prayer connects me with who He is.
mm,
Um, I try to tell God in my prayers, I know you are loving, and I know that you are kind, and that you are good, and that you are just and merciful. And I know that you are in control. And even though I am suffering, I know that you see me. And like you said, um, I believe He stands beside me.
mm,
And there is a verse I love in the Bible. It's something to the effect of when we sit in darkness, God sits with us.
mm,
And I say that I know that I'm in darkness right now, but I know that you not only sit with me, but you've brought a candle. That's the image that I have in my mind of God sitting with us. And I believe that He sent His Son to die for our sins. And because of that grief that He felt, God the Father felt, I feel that He understands grief and
mm.
suffering.
Yeah.
And that connects me as I pray and I remember who God is, what He's done, and what He continues to do.
Mhm.
And for me, that definitely, for me particular, that is really what helps ground me in those really dark moments when I feel really overwhelmed with
Yeah.
grief, like those waves crashing and I can't even get a breath. So connecting with God, I think it's something that really helps me personally.
And it brings you that comfort. And what I love about that is you're really just saying these words in this mantra. It doesn't
Yeah,
have to be that, say a prayer from beginning to end. And,
right.
it is really just letting yourself go and connect and be able to say what you need to say.
And
Uh,
sometimes it's just me sitting in bed crying,
mhm.
and I tell God, I'm really sad.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's it. That's all I say in my prayers. Or I say, I'm really mad about this situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
I started to realize God can handle me being mad.
Yeah.
Even at Him, I can be mad at Him. He can handle it. And so I sit with Him like a child and I say, this is really, really sad.
Yeah.
And yes, definitely just simple words, straightforward, acknowledge truth, and that really does help in that moment.
That brings you comfort. Well,
Yes.
thank you so much. I just love how honest and open you are. And, and to my listeners, if this isn't for you, this way of meditation or prayer, make it unique. Do your thing. What fits into your life? When we started this, I asked you point blank, what was your vision for your life? And sometimes we walk down a path, and sometimes that vision might have been chosen for you if somebody had chosen, this is where you're supposed to go with your life. This is what my expectations were of you. If you have parents that had that expectation, and then you mold it with your own. But as we grow and change, our lives change, our paths change, our journey changes. So find what brings you closer to your grief and allow you to heal and recognize that. Love to hear your questions, love to hear your concerns. I'm sure Sarah would love to come back to help or answer any questions. Do find her book. I didn't sign up for this at saraefrazer.com or on Amazon. And until next time, remember, we don't grieve alone, so we don't heal alone. It is only together that we will heal. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Grief Uprooted professional grief and empowerment coaching are not to be used as a substitute for professional advice by legal, medical, financial, business, spiritual, or other qualified professionals. All our products and services are designed for grief empowerment through learning and sharing of one's lived experiences.